This is Trump on Earth. I'm Reed Fraser. History doesn't repeat itself, but it rhymes, or so the saying goes. President Trump has put fossil fuel production at the top of his priorities. As a result, he's attempted to slash nearly 100 environmental regulations. That is a lot, but fossil fuels, in particular oil, has always been a big priority for American presidents. Today, we talk with someone who's written a book about that history. He asks, who's got a bigger hold over who? Big Oil or Uncle Sam? That's coming up in a minute.
Hi, I'm Nate Cubis.
And I'm Reggie Cubis.
We're the sons of Trump on Earth producer Andy Cubis.
She works behind the scenes.
We think you should support this podcast on how do you say this word? Patreon. Because the environment matters for us kids.
Go to patreon.com/TrumpOnEarth to learn more.
You can pledge as little as $1 a month.
We can even afford that with our measly allowance, right, Nate?
Right. Thank you.
Oil, Power, and War is a sweeping history of big oil's influence over global politics from the 1850s until now, and it explains a lot about the world we live in. The book's subtitle is A Dark History, and it looks at big oil's ties to Nazi Germany, Iran, Saudi Arabia, Iraq, and beyond. Joining me now is the book's author, Matthieu Auzanneau. He joins me from Paris, where he's executive director of the Shift Project, a think tank that advocates for a post-carbon world. Matthieu, thank you so much for being with us.
Thank you.
Okay, so this is a book about the intricate relationship between the oil industry and what we'll call the Western powers, primarily the United States, the UK, and to certain degrees, France and other countries. What got you interested in this topic?
It goes back in my teenage years. I think watching the movie Mad Max made me think a lot.
Tomorrow, in a world gone mad.
I was like, that's an interesting question. What happens if oil becomes scarce? And what is the link between energy and power?
You don't want to make Max mad. Because when Max gets mad, he gets even. American International presents Mad Max, the maximum force of the future.
And, well, that's maybe more like for the anecdote, but perhaps more seriously, I was deeply impressed by the invasion of Iraq in 2003. And I was like, man, what are the odds that the Bush family and the Bin Laden family knew each other, had contacts for several decades? What were the odds? And I started wondering, well, what is the Bush family phenomenon exactly? Is it a singularity in the American history? Or on the contrary, is there a thread, a link between the energy industry on one hand, the big oil industry, and the political power? And when you think about it a little bit, and if you have not slept all the time in high school, you realize that when you talk about power, whether it's political power or corporation power or even individual power, there is a compact relationship with the ability to have the proper sources of energy to exercise power. And that's what you learn in physics. Power is energy over time. A watt equals a joule per second. And that's the whole frame of the book. Who had the energy means to exercise its power during that 20th century, which was the century of the explosion of the expression of human power?
Yeah, let's go back into that history. This book starts essentially with the Standard Oil era from around the 1870s to about 1911, when the U.S. government broke it up, and I'm using air quotes because it parts of it remained intact to this day in the form of the oil majors. How foundational was Standard Oil in this story that you're telling of oil and economic, political, even military power?
Well, I think that the name Standard Oil and the name of Rockefeller is a symbol of U.S. capitalism.
Today, the giants of the oil industry stand as monuments to Rockefeller, the architect of our business age.
The way it sprang up in the early days of U.S. economy on the world scale.
Gushing oil, America's black gold, was the foundation of his empire. Yet America knew Rockefeller best in his years of retirement. One of his favorite customs was donating dimes to encourage thrift.
And if you look back at the foundation of Wall Street, you realize that the two main banks, the two, so to speak, pillars of Wall Street, that is to say, the Chase Manhattan and what has become Citibank or Citigroup, both banks are Rockefeller banks. That is to say, banks that developed thanks to the incredible profits of the oil industry. You have to say it's incredible and exceptional because for physical reasons, there are no industries that is as generous as the oil industry when it comes to create profits. And that is for a physical reason. When you drill an oil well, you have to drill it and then you have to plug it to a pipeline. And then if you are lucky, you're sitting on an actual gold mine, a black gold mine, for many years or even many decades, if you are very lucky like the Saudis or like the US. You have to remember symbols like the fact that the United Nations headquarters is built on land that was given by the Rockefeller family. That is a symbol of how large, how profound the extension of the power that was given to the Rockefeller family by black gold and then given by the Rockefeller family to American capitalism and the règle du jeu, the rule of the whole Western world.
Rockefeller Center, outstanding development of modern times, rears its lofty tower to the sky, a fitting monument in steel and stone to the man who built the world's greatest fortune and devoted it to the service of his fellow man.
You surveyed how many of these Western countries set about to control oil reserves. This was a very important aspect of global policy really throughout the 20th century, but really especially after World War II. There are so many countries that you survey, Iraq, Iran, Saudi Arabia, that are pertinent, absolutely critical to understanding our foreign policy today. Can you walk me through how the oil industry in the Middle East used American, foreign policy and how integral the U.S. government was in helping these companies achieve dominance over some of these oil reserves?
Yeah, that's the key. That's very interesting. As you've understood, the whole frame of the book is to try to tell the history of power, political power, military power, corporation power, through the necessity of having access to the proper energy resources to exert that power. It's very interesting for me to notice that the U.S. economy was once the first energy producer and oil producer and also exporter. And then something happened, which is a natural phenomenon in 1970. That year, conventional oil production in the US entered a long decline for environmental reasons. That's the starting point of the dreadful projection of force by the US to control the new center of the chessboard of energy in the world, which went from the US to the Persian Gulf, precisely when the oil production in the US started to be too low to fill the tank of the US economy. When you realize that, for instance, the way the geopolitical masters in Washington used Iraq, for instance, used Saddam Hussein to fulfill their goal, which was to tick the US flag firmly, very firmly in the Gulf region, and to achieve the main goal, which was for the US to remain the sole and ultimate hegemonic power at the center of the energy chessboard, which was the Gulf War. Al-Qaeda came from that. You do not understand anything at what happened from the 80s up until now if you don't realize that to exercise its paramount power, the US economy has to dominate the Gulf region. The Bush family, father and son, they were very much on that agenda. And in some extent, Donald Trump is still on that agenda. I noticed that when on his political platform in 2016, he mentioned usually political leaders talk about energy independence. Donald Trump talked about energy dominance.
And that's why we're pursuing a future not only of energy independence, but not just words. You know, you've been hearing energy independence for years and years, and you'd hear it. We have real independence. But what we want now is not independence. We want American energy dominance. Dominance. Instead of relying on foreign countries, we are now relying on American producers, and we are relying on American workers to build our own future right here on American soil. It's time.
So for me, there's a continuous thread for the U.S. Economy, but you have the same kind of thread for any industrial power. Today, China is the main importer of oil all over the world, so they have a whole geopolicy regarding that issue. They have to be friends with Iran. They have to check the U.S. agenda in Iran in order for them to fill the tank of their own economy. But you have also the same kind of logic for France, for secondary power, such as France. We have a very dark history, we French people, with our former colonies who had the chance and the luck and the bad luck to have oil under the ground. In Algeria, for instance, or in Gabon, or in Congo-Brazzaville. In all those countries, the French government made sure that he would remain the ultimate hegemon.
One major element of all of this, almost at the center of all these stories that you're telling, is one company called Saudi Aramco. Can you explain how central Saudi Arabia and Aramco has been to American foreign policy, especially since Saudi Arabia is in the news almost every day these days? This seems like a very important history to understand.
Yeah.
Until recently, one of the least explored regions of the world was northeasterly Saudi Arabia, a parched desert across which hardy Bedouins drove their flocks in a never-ending quest for forage and water.
So it's the national oil company in Saudi Arabia. Its name used to be Aramco, and Aramco stands for Arabian American Oil Company.
In eastern Saudi Arabia, the Arabian American Oil Company, called Aramco for short, discovered 5 major fields during the decade after the first commercial producing well was completed in 1938.
So what does this mean? In the 30s, right under the nose of the British, US oil businessmen realized that Saudi Arabia had tremendous oil resources.
On this same desert, camps were set up of a sort never seen here before. Small airplanes on supply and reconnaissance missions roared overhead, and sturdy trucks beat new paths on the desert. They were carrying Arabs and Americans, surveying a route for a great oil pipeline, a pipeline bearing on the recovery of Western Europe, the prosperity of the Middle East, and the stability of the world.
And up until the 80s, it remained a US company. And that was the prime jewel of the US oil empire. Why is that? Very simple. Because Mother Nature happened to give the largest oil reserves to the Saudis. the Saudi king made this deal with Roosevelt. On the way back from the Yalta conference in 1944, Roosevelt stopped along the Suez Canal to settle this historical deal with Ibn Saud, which is usually summarized as oil for security. But even after that, Saudi Arabia and Washington kept a very close, compact relationship. For instance, Al-Qaeda and Osama bin Laden is one of the results of very direct results of this very compact and intimate and intricate and sometimes scary relationship. And up until today, most of the American presidents, when they arrive in the White House, their first trip is to go to Saudi Arabia. So that simple, trivial fact gives you the reason why Saudi Arabia, a very remote, desertic country, is that much at the center of the policy of the most powerful nation in the world.
One question that comes to mind is how central is understanding oil in understanding why the U.S. and Western allies have been fighting wars in this region since like the 1990s and probably even before then?
My answer to this is very simple. If you want to remain in power, you need energy. That's the basic fact. Right now, with the whole shale oil boom in the US, you have this mindset that is changing a little bit. People are saying in the US, well, we have oil now, again. So we no longer need to fight wars that nobody understands with this strange agenda of trying to remain at the top of the game around the Persian Gulf. But I would argue that this is not going to last because the thirst of oil all around the world remains, and it remains very high in the US. It's very hard to be certain that the shale oil that is booming right now is going to remain for several decades. The trouble is that oil is an inexhaustible resource. At some point, the faster you empty a glass, the faster it's empty. Mad Max is not just a bad nightmare. It's a reality for several countries in the world. When you look at Venezuela, its production is decreasing. When you look at China, not many people know that, but China is a very large oil producer, but it has passed its so-called peak oil, and its production is declining. So we fought many wars for access to oil when oil was plentiful. You have to wonder what's going to happen when oil will become, and it will become, a scarce resource.
Yeah, I wonder, in the U.S., I live in a region where there's a lot of this unconventional oil and gas, mainly natural gas, but you see these drilling rigs all over the place. I wonder how much the shale revolution has changed this paradigm, this story. It sounds like from what you're telling me, you don't think it's changed all that much.
That's the big question. Conventional oil production, which brings to the market the 3/4 of the production, it has passed its historical peak production. It's in decline. Conventional oil production has been on a plateau for 10 years now, and its production is slowly decreasing. And you have many regions in the world that are in decline. Algeria, Venezuela, China. I could talk about the North Sea, which is our main source of oil that we have, and only that we have in Western Europe. So you can look at the shale oil and shale gas phenomenon. You can look at it as a solution to this problem of conventional oil production decreasing for geological reason. You can look at it as a solution or as a symptom. In Pennsylvania, you have to remember that before shale gas started to boom, 10 years ago? A century ago, the place of birth of the whole U.S. oil industry was Pennsylvania, conventional oil production. That production peaked in the late 19th century, And that oil has been exhausted for a long time. And the source rock in which shale oil producers are tapping to exploit and produce shale oil is the actual source rock of the conventional oil that is now exhausted. So you have to remember that and zoom back on the proper historical scale. Well, you have this boom that's been going on for 10 years. Is it going to last 10 more years? There are many doubts about that issue that don't come from environmentalists, but that come from observers of the industry, geologists, for instance. Some of the main sources regarding the oil industry that say that the shale oil boom is going to be on a plateau and level off as of next year.
So there are these twin crises in this story. One is, of course, climate change, but another is this question of, are we going to reach peak oil, so to speak, and be in a world where there's less and less oil available for use? I don't know. Do you have any predictions, or how do you see this playing out in the next few years or decades?
I don't do prediction. I try to be cautious. So the peak of conventional oil production, it was passed in 2008, according to the International Energy Agency. And that conventional oil production represents the 3/4 of the whole liquid fuel production. The quantity of oil that we discover each year is less than the quantity of oil that we consume. So it's not rocket science to figure that this will have an end at some point, and possibly an unpleasant ending if we are not cautious enough. So the most optimistic prediction say that peak oil will probably happen in the 40s. That's when you listen to ExxonMobil, for instance. The less optimistic put the date during this decade. And for instance, the International Energy Agency, which is very important in that discussion, says that we would need to triple the production of shale oil worldwide in order to compensate for the decline of conventional oil production. And if we don't do that, if we don't triple that production, we will have a supply crunch, a possible supply crunch. That's a quote, an actual quote from the executive summary of the latest annual International Energy Agency report, around the year 2025, that is 5 years from now. So I don't make prediction. I just say when you have one of the most important sources of information regarding that issue that is say we are at the risk of facing a supply crunch worldwide in the year 2025, you need to be cautious. You need to take that question seriously.
Well, Matthieu Auzanneau, thank you so much for joining me.
Merci beaucoup. Merci beaucoup, Ed. By the way, thank you very much for your interest. You're the very first and only interview I've had on this book. I mean, on the translation. I've had quite some success in France. I've had a very nice review in Nature magazine in the UK and also in Geographical magazine in the UK. But from the US, nothing. So I'm very glad to answer your interview. Very.
Thanks for listening to Trump on Earth. We don't get any oil money, but we do get money through Patreon. So if you like our show, please consider supporting us through Patreon. Just go to patreon.com/TrumpOnEarth. You can find us online at trumponearth.org and anywhere you get your podcasts. Write us a review and tell your friends. The podcast is supported by the Robert F. Schuman Foundation. Our producer and digital editor is Andy Cubis. Kathy Nauer is executive producer. I'm Reed Frazier. Thanks so much. We'll see you next time.